faces to me, but just by way of introduction, I am the Global Program Director for Lustre Media. And so we are an apologetics ministry helping to promote or promulgate the tenets of intelligent design. Yes, is it not working?
I don't know what to look for.
It should be like a red.
You know, you can do it. You know the little earpiece?
It's clearly recording. I just don't know
Yeah.
if it's recording the audio.
Do you know the earpiece? There's an earpiece that's off of the little remote.
Oh,
thing
you know,
on
that's
the top.
obviously sitting in front of me dangling.
Yeah. You just listen to that.
Are you going to edit this out later?
I know you. Am I coming in?
All right.
Wow.
Yeah, we're good. All right. Sorry. Left that part out there.
Okay. Well, there'll be a lot of editing, especially when I said the C word. Okay, where did I leave off? I left off. So Lustre Media. Our mission is to use or utilize the most up-to-date media distribution channels in order to help articulate and promulgate the tenets of intelligent design. Many of you guys have maybe encountered some of our films. We have what are considered the preeminent documentaries on the science of intelligent design. So we actually explore and investigate or interview some of the top researchers in the respective fields that correlate to many of the things we're going to discuss tonight. So what I do with Lustre Media is I go around, I do a lot of teaching, I help write some blogs, I do social media stuff. So I'm kind of the face of Lustre Media. And I'd like to take credit for some of the film work that we do, but albeit my 12-year-old daughter is the first one to ever make it into the credits of one of our films. And that's our most recent one, Flight, which we just released. So anyway, she's excited about that. So go see it and look for my daughter's name in it. Anyway, okay, so tonight, real quick, the topic tonight is going to go in a certain direction. I'll tell you guys about what we're going to discuss, but to let you guys know, what prompted the discussion tonight was there was an inquiry from somebody, and I can't remember who, but Jim brought it up, and somebody wanted to know about the research projects that intelligent design has inspired, or perhaps that was relevant and leads to some practical, societal benefits, right? Which is a great question. What's often levied against intelligent design are many things about it not being scientific and so forth. And this is one of those that essentially, if intelligent design is not bringing about some meaningful type of research and progress in understanding about how the world is made, and also coming up with certain things that can help in medicine, right, in bioengineering and so forth. If it's not doing some of that, then it does seem to kind of evade, I think, an important scientific foundation. So we did want to address that, but and I've invited Ryan here, well, actually more Ryan invited me, but Ryan's going to talk specifically to the scientific projects, because when often, by the way, when it's levied against intelligent design is quite simply is that people haven't done their homework. There are many research projects that intelligent design has been inspired, many research grants that are moving forward, and Ryan's going to touch to those more specifically. But albeit when we kind of discussed this, we thought, this question emerges in kind of what we call the category of the common objections to intelligent design. And we thought that, because also the content probably wouldn't stretch over an hour, we thought, well, why not cover some of those other things? So and then as we discussed that, we realized, well, it's difficult to understand how we overcome some of these objections without properly understanding what intelligent design is and what it isn't. So, with all that being said, what we're going to do tonight, if it's okay with you guys, is we're going to begin with just kind of a high-level overview of intelligent design. And I'm going to feed you with a fire hose with just the quick nuts and bolts of what it is and what it isn't. Following that, we're going to encounter some or review some of the objections that are commonly levied against intelligent design. Beginning with, and most importantly, the very question that brought us here, which is what scientific research projects have been inspired by that. And Ryan will come up to do that part. We'll follow up with covering up some other certain objections. And if time permits, what I may like to do is I'd like to actually turn that same discernment or the same questions that are often levied to intelligent design and turn them towards neo-Darwinian theory and see how that actually holds up in comparison to ID. So anyway, how does that sound? That work for you guys? Okay. Now, how many of you guys are familiar with intelligent design? Lots of you guys? Most? Okay. All right. Who's the most familiar? Because I need you to come up and I'll teach you this. Okay, so what is intelligent design? Real quickly, a brief definition of it is intelligent design is the assertion that certain features of reality are best explained by an intelligent agent, and that a scientific testable criteria is available to establish intelligent agent causality. All right, how does that sound? Mouthful? Let me repeat that. That essentially, and I'll try to use more limited term, it's the idea that we can recognize that agent activity in the universe and recognize it in such a way using rigorous scientific analysis in order to do that. So testable models to determine, did something come about by the process of mere chance or probabilistic chemical necessity, or was it the product of a mind operating? Now, we do this all the time, and that's one of the things I'm going to point out, is that our intuitions run into various phenomena in the world, and we're immediately either recognizing it as either just nature, natural properties, or the operation of a mind building something, right? So we see things like, if we see writing in the sand, we know that if we recognize it as the English alphabet and it spells out certain words, we know that that didn't come about because the waves started crashing into the sand, right? But that appeals to our intuitions, and we know that that's right, but is there a way to use a scientific process in order to evaluate, is that indeed from an intelligent agent, and apply that same criteria to other things to determine their causality, what brought them about? Okay, so that's all intelligent design is. It's this idea that says, let's open up the toolbox of available explanations in the scientific realm and say, not everything has to be explained in terms of just natural processes. And why intelligent design does this is because it's actually not new to science. So many scientific disciplines have already been doing this for quite some time. And I'll reference studies like archaeology. We know that when we find certain artifacts, we can determine if it was developed by an intelligent agent or not. And if you study, for example, paleoanthropology, many times they'll find kind of crude implements, but they have enough of a semblance of look like they were designed that they realize that these were tools made by maybe ancient hominids, right? But without the detective capabilities of agent causality, they might just mistake it for just a random rock. And now often, too, it might just be a random rock, but it might be in the right shape and form that it was accumulated into a certain place, right, where these hominids might use them. But anyway, so archaeology is one. The SETI program, right, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, that presumes that we can filter from just ambient noise in the universe and actually detect a signal that must have been manufactured from an intelligent agent, right? You guys know about the SETI program? That makes sense? Right? It's the idea that we're listening to the cosmos and we're hoping to hear like a radio signal that then when analyzed can be measured against something that we might know. The most common example is that they might send us a stream of prime numbers. Right? Prime numbers are all the numbers that can only be divisible by themselves and 1. And so like everyone's seen the movie Contact? Right? So in the movie Contact, that was the way that suddenly they were able to determine that the signal came from probably an intelligent source, and so they gathered that signal and then found out it was this blueprint for all this stuff, and then they really interesting storyline followed from that. But anyway, so it's measuring from the cosmos, or anticipating that we can measure from the cosmos recognizable signals and so forth. And again, there's a formula that I'm going to get into about how we can determine if a signal is indeed from an intelligent agent. Cryptography is also one. Criminology is another. So these are not, it's not foreign to science that we would invoke the ability to interpret intelligent causality. Okay? Now, what is the criteria for determining if something is the property of an intelligent agent? Well, first, it must be complex. Right? Now, it doesn't mean that intelligent agents can't make simple things, but we just know that we can't infer something simple from as an intelligent agent because it could potentially come about by natural processes. So, for example, something that's simple might be a drop of water, Now that drop of water could have been put on the leaf by an intelligent agent, but we would never infer that, right? Most of the time we would say, okay, drop of water is very simple. It's probably happened there by chance, okay? So it must be instead of simple, it must be complex, right? So complex arrangement would be a whole bunch of drops of water accumulated together in a certain area, right? But now, is this enough to determine intelligent causality? No, right? Right. We would recognize this as just a random pattern of raindrops, right, on maybe glass pane. Okay. So there's a second element that needs to be there. So first, complexity gets us part of the way there. The second element is we need to have what's called specificity. Okay. Specificity is, and I'm going to use some industry terms, and then I'll try to break it down a little bit. But specificity means that it has a referent that is other than itself, right? So water, in this case, is somehow in the configuration of two penguins, okay? And we recognize penguins as something wholly, separate from water. It has nothing to do with water. And so we know that has specificity, right? And when we look at this, intuition says that this could happen by wind and erosion, or just the freezing of water, or must have been an intelligent agent. Okay. Intelligent agent, right? And why is that? It can't happen randomly, right? And we know that by intuition, right? And so, but what I'm saying is now to bring it to a more scientific rigor is we could say, well, it specifies something other than itself. Okay. Now, there's going to be some obvious objections, and I'll hopefully try to get to some of those, or I will get to some of those. But these sculptures have such a specificity, that there's such a pristine design to them in their reference to another element that has what we call strong specificity, right? So it would defy logic to try to invoke natural wind and erosion and just the freezing process of the winter would maybe bring these about, right? Because they're just too specified to the two elements. Okay? Now, one way that we could explain this, right, is that as water freezes, water begins to slow down. And then as it hits a certain temperature, right, it then begins to fuse with each other, right, and form a crystallic type substance we call ice, right? Now, so somebody could come along and say, well, I can explain this. I can explain this by the process of water turning into ice, right? But does the ability of looking at just the physical properties alone and how they're able to attract each other, is that enough to explain this configuration? No, right? It still means that this configuration comes in a certain form that specifies something else, okay? So, in another analogy is, I can talk about how much ink can stick to paper, but that doesn't explain all of the abundant information that is available on this piece of paper, okay? And that's going to become relevant as we look to something specific in biology and so forth in the intelligent design debate, which is why I bring that up. Okay? Let me pause right there. Any questions so far? No? Most of that makes sense, you guys? Okay. All right, where are we at? Okay. A couple quick things about this, and I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. But one of the, I think, preeminent problems with the debate between intelligent design and evolution today is, and I say evolution in the macro sense. I don't want to get into too many of the different definitions of evolution. But just by way of qualification, what I do want to say before I move forward is that we know unequivocally that evolution is true. Okay, so I want to reiterate that we know that without a doubt that evolution is indeed true. Okay? Now that may shock you to hear me say that, but what I mean by that is that we know that things change over time, and in particular, biological creatures have done that. Okay? We know that, we've tested it, we've seen it empirically. Okay? What intelligent design doubts is the ability to change to such a degree that it can build new structures, or new forms, and new species. And that's what we are going to challenge today. Okay? And so, one of the things I wanted to bring up is and why I'm going to talk about this in a moment, you guys will all take a few notes, but to help try to explain this is that where I believe that the confusion comes up is that there is certainly a possibility that indeed an evolution could happen. Right? It's possible that what we use as an explanatory model in purely naturalistic terms could in fact have been the case. Right? However, no one disputes the fact it's highly improbable. Okay? Where we all differ, though, is that what intelligent design acknowledges, I think, is that the probabilities are so extremely minute that it makes it almost utterly absurd in order to do that. And hopefully with enough time today, I'm going to demonstrate the fact and get into the specific mathematics to show that with the proper probabilities understood, that the most reasonable conclusion is that evolution is, in the form of macroevolution, is utterly impossible. And how I'm doing that is, again, David Edel says this. He says, the question for scientific methodology should not be, is this scenario possible, right? Ice could freeze and make the form of two penguins, right? That is possible to do, right? We can conceive of it. There's nothing inherently in the properties of water and freezing that would prevent that from being able to happen, okay? But, as we all know in our intuition, it just seems too improbable for that to be an occurrence. And the same question should be applied to evolution. So he says, is this scenario possible? Or it should not be that we ask, is this scenario possible? So the question should be, is this possibility a plausible scientific hypothesis? Okay? And how we determine that is probabilities. Okay? One of the things I want to get into real quick, okay, this is going to get into a lot of math, and so hopefully I'll get through this and it'll make some sense. But if we calculate what I call the universal plausibility metric, okay, and somebody else coined this, I forgot the gentleman's name, but this came by way to me of a good friend with Ratio Christie Curtis, who's actually helps to run one of the chapters in North Carolina. But and I love this argument because what this does is we're taking the maximum possible event horizon, meaning the maximum number of possible events that could even occur in the entire universe as we know it, and determine under that framework could some of the probabilities that we're going to discuss happen. And so what we did is we took the number of elementary particles in the universe, estimated right now about 10 to the 80, okay, huge number. But and then inside of that, we said, what's the smallest increment of time? Okay, if you haven't studied quantum physics, we exist in a world that is quantized, and essentially, time does not actually just keep on going, but it's like a movie. You know, we see movies in 30 frames per second. Well, in reality, we're seeing this movie play to us at 10 to the 43 frames per second. So a lot higher resolution than movies. But there is an element in which time cannot be broken down lower than 1 in 10 to the 43 seconds. Okay? So does that make sense then that for every second, that's the maximum number of events that could happen? Right? Yeah.
So are you familiar with Zeno's paradox at all?
Yeah, vaguely.
Okay.
Yeah.
It would seem like item number 2 that's listed there would be a counterexample to Zeno's paradox. Zeno's paradox is predicated on the notion that if you always could divide time into smaller pieces, you never could move. Because in order to go from point A to point B, you'd have to traverse an infinite number of points. And so that's interesting. So if you really can't divide time or distance beyond a certain level, that would be a counterexample to Zeno's paradox.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, we discussed that very thing. He's talking about, just for the recording, Zeno's paradox. But yeah, in fact, I think even this was the last time I was here talking about it, that very question came up. And we talked about how all of reality, time and space, are quantized. So we couldn't keep dividing it in half. So yeah, Zeno's paradox from scientific methodology has been debunked. So that's good. But anyway, and then lastly, we look at the oldest age of the universe, or oldest estimates of the universe. Most people estimate about 13.5 billion years, but we'll give it kind of an upper level of 20 billion years, right? And that comes out to 10 to the 17 seconds. Okay. So one thing by way of qualification, of course this is an absurd argument from the standpoint of we are granting as much as possible to the evolutionary paradigm in this case. In that, what I'm going to suggest is that if we turn every particle into its own laboratory and then allowed it to run an experiment during every quantum moment possible from the very beginning of time, I'm going to argue that even that would not have enough probabilistic resources in order to bring about what we see as the immensely improbable configuration of life that we have today. Okay, so does that make sense? Okay. So if we combine them together, right, it means that there are a total of up to now 10 to the 140th total events that have occurred in the entire universe, assuming every particle, right, having an event and so forth. All right, does that make sense?
Now, can you explain what is an event in that scenario again?
An event would mean that it transpired a Planck moment, right? So the minimal quantum fraction of time, and that it was able to perform something. So,
is that in parallel, or is that?
Yeah. So every particle, right, 10 to the 80, at the same moment, is each getting to run 10 to the 43 experiments per second.
Okay.
Right? And they've been doing that for the last 20 billion years. Okay? So what we're going to see is probably why it's been so difficult for man to create life in the laboratory. So, a couple of things that are, again, going back to the specified complexity, there's several examples that intelligent design points to as fulfilling the dual criteria of having intelligent agent causality, right? Specificity and complexity. I'm going to focus in on just a few of them, but first and foremost would be just the basic biological unit, right, which is a single cell. Okay? And in a single cell, if we just can create a single cell, they say the most basic configuration would require 300 proteins all working in cooperation. And one of the things Ryan's going to get into is some experiments that have been inspired by the intelligent design movement to determine what are the probabilities that a certain protein would actually have any kind of function. Right? Hopefully, I think we're covering that one, right? If not, I'll cover it. But it's Doug Axe's work. So,
Yeah.
Based upon that, those probabilities that he's going to get into, or we'll discuss. But if we take that and just multiply it by 300, that's the minimum number of proteins. That's the lowest estimate anyone's come up with to say that we could have a single cell, self-replicating cell. And now, if you do the math, it turns out that the probabilities of having the first biological form come about by chance is 1 in 10 to the 22,800. Okay? Now, what does that compare to the number of experiments that we were going to have? What was that number in our event horizon? What's that?
10 to the 140.
10 to the 140, right? So what this is saying, and again, using very conservative numbers, is that we need manifold more universes that all have every single particle for 20 billion years, all performing an experiment 10 to the 43 times per second in order to even bring about the first living cell. Yes, question?
Is that based, you referenced the 300 proteins is the minimum number for a reproducing cell. Is that based on the structure of the proteins then, or does that also take into account the genome associated with coding?
Yeah, so the probabilities would just, if we're going to take it from the information-bearing properties of the DNA, would be equally, like in probabilistic terms, right? The same requirement. So to come up with like a DNA strand that would have the information that could properly code for it would be in that same realm of probabilities. Right? Does that make sense? So yes, I'm drawing this analogy from the idea of the functionality of the protein, but we know that in order to make that certain protein and the probabilities for it requires that amount of information. So the information requirements is tantamount to the functional probabilities. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure for you. You're saying that in effect includes the probabilities too for the genome, because the coding would create the protein.
Yeah, right. So, like, if we make an argument from the different vantage point of saying, okay, what's the probability of being able to make a DNA strand with the right information that could then code for the 300 or so proteins to make the first self-replicating cell? Then the information requirements for that, or to come up naturally, would be in the same ballpark. And by the way, I mean, again, I'm using very, very conservative numbers. Others have done more sophisticated analysis and have determined this number is more like 10 to the 10 to the 143 or something like that. So I'm using really, really conservative numbers. Yes?
So is part of the way that, if you will, secular scientists, if you will, compensate for that by coming up with the theory of multi-universes?
They do, yeah. The multiverse is the most preeminent argument to counter both this as well as the fine-tuning that happens for the universe. And so, yeah, I think right now, and often the appeal will be to, well, science has made so much progress up to this point. Let's hold out to see if science will discover a naturalistic explanation for it. So,
one question. When they say universe, what is universe now? Because I'm so confused. There's so many galaxies. Everything is included, or the ones that haven't been discovered yet? They keep talking about that.
yeah, right. So the question is, what's the universe, right? The universe encompasses essentially what we know as from first off, from the observation, we can see to the end of the observable portions of the universe, right? Doesn't mean that we can see all of the universe. In fact, what's something interesting, if you don't know this, is that the universe is expanding so fast, it is expanding faster than the light can get to us. So we're seeing only what they estimate, I think about 1/3 of the universe is observable. But at any rate, probably a better way to describe it is it's what encompasses the entirety of the space-time theorems that were developed in relativity theory and so forth that comprises essentially everything that came about what we call from the Big Bang. Right? So there was a singularity moment, everything came about, all of space and time as we know it existed, and whatever encompasses in that would be included in what I describe as the universe. Okay? So multiple galaxies, yeah. Yes?
What's the best quotable source to justify that number for people if they ask?
Oh, this number, yeah. The best quotable source would be Tyler Geffeney from Luster Media. I did this because there are numbers out there that I haven't gone through the math, but that are far greater than this, that people have done with sophisticated analysis, and so I felt like I just wanted to put something like that that's easier to explain. So all I did is I'm going to take the numbers that come from a certain study, a research project that we're going to be getting into in just a little bit, and it talks about the probabilities of a single functional protein amongst the possible configurations of like a protein structure, and then multiply it by the minimum number of proteins that are estimated for a single cell to be able to be self-replicating, to be essentially alive, which that is what's required in order to evoke evolutionary processes to then have natural selection operating and so forth in evolution. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So this is not a rigorous number, but what I will say, it's rigorously underestimating the number, in which it defies, again, the probabilistic probabilities for a chance to bring that about. And I'm going to quote just an eminent scientist, astrophysicist from Arizona, Paul Davies, who basically said, he was quoted, by the way, he's not a friend to intelligent design, but he still says, he recognizes the fact that the constants of the physical universe have been balanced on such a knife's edge, though we don't know any edge that sharp. And he went on to say that he goes, it seems in some sense as though the universe knew we were coming. And again, this is a guy that doesn't acknowledge intelligent design, but recognizes that the incalculable improbabilities in which these parameters were set, and there's no physical necessity. That's one of the things that they determined, is that there is nothing that drives that they had to be set at these certain parameters, and yet they did in order to be able to sustain intelligent life. Okay, and then again, the DNA information properties. So if we take it from, instead of the cellular components, but just information in DNA, again, specified complexity. Just like this indicates information, right? This itself is also a reference to something else, right? It talks about how to build proteins for actual life and so forth. And we know only one causality for information in all the universe, right? It's mind. Okay? And that's true in every instance in which we encounter. There's only one field of study which we tried that has proposed, and in fact, something other than a mind has brought about information, and that is in the evolutionary debate. Okay. And so, quote from Franklin Harold, he says, there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. Okay? And again, a quote from not a friend of intelligent design. Okay, and then lastly, the bacteria flagellum, where we look at just an example of finely tuned machinery. Many have quoted and said that bacterial flagellum is the most efficient machine in the universe, which achieves almost 100% energy efficiency, which is the best in man-made capabilities. It goes up to about 65%. And if you don't notice, the flagellum spins about 100,000 RPM per second and can stop and reverse directions in 1/4 of a turn. So anyway, a phenomenal machine. Okay. So lastly, so what intelligent design says is that of all of these components, they're either due to chance, physical law, which is necessity, or design. We know it's not by physical law. We've done many, many tests over the last many decades to try to determine that, as people have been passionately trying to pursue an explanation that would bring about necessity for this, and they've come up empty on that. We also know it's not due to chance because the probabilities are outside of the upper levels of the probabilistic chances, and so therefore it must be design, and design implies a designer. Okay, so that is intelligent design in a nutshell. I'm going to skip the rest of these and let you get on to yours. How's that? At this point, any questions? Come up while they're asking questions. You gotta load your PowerPoint anyway. So Ryan's going to discuss first in handling the objection of which has been commonly placed is against intelligent design, is that intelligent design doesn't do any research. Right?
The presentation talked about like plausibility and possibility, and like what you're basically saying is that there is no possibility that like the Earth just came about, or like life just came about.
Yeah. And what I'm trying to say is that, and I'm kind of playing fast with the words possibility, but I was arguing that it is indeed possible that evolution could have come about, but it's possible in the conceptual sense that, like, we could think of, it's possible for water to freeze into a configuration of two, what did I have? Penguins. Sorry, I was about to say pelican. Two penguins, right? But there's something in our intuitions that knows that that's not very likely. And where I feel like the argument gets lost is that we take what's possible, or at least conceptually possible, but we are unable to wrap our arms around the actual probabilities. And when we do wrap our arms around the probabilities and actually give it a mathematical measurement and apply, I think, a more rigorous scientific approach to it, we determine that what is possible is essentially not possible given our time horizon, event horizon, and things that we've discovered. Yes?
Yeah, it seems like a useful distinction to make. I don't know if you both feel this way, but I mean, ID doesn't exclude the idea of evolution.
Right.
But we need to distinguish what we're talking about, Darwinism or evolution. So it seems useful to always remember Darwinism postulates that the random genetic mutations created all this complexity. And that's Darwinism, right?
Yeah, that would be neo-Darwinism.
Yeah,
right?
so yeah, neo-Darwinism. So whereas evolution, in a general sense, ID does not have an issue with, right? So it seems like that's a good distinction to make if we're talking in the conversation between evolution or Darwinian evolution.
Yeah,
is that true, or?
I would say it's true to the degree, and again, that we affirm that certainly evolution is true. We don't dispute that. And in fact, evolution can do some pretty cool things. So, like, you know, we'll maybe even get into some of the things, I don't know how in detail, but there's some things where, you know, like bacteria can fix itself to be able to process or digest citrate, right? But, and while that sounds pretty impressive, though, as we get into maybe hopefully more detail, we'll find out, though, it's very, very limited. I mean, it can do some cool things, but to such a degree that's so below what we need to do. It's like saying, well, the fact that I can jump 3 inches off the ground means that probably humans could probably dunk a basketball that's 90 miles in the air. So we need to be careful about what we can do. Intelligent design doesn't have a problem even with like speciation. It's possible that there could be species. That's difficult though to describe because we don't even really know what a species is or what are the bounds of a species. Different definitions of that abound. But anyway, so yes, it's not that an anti-evolution. It's just that purely blind physical natural processes operating alone, autonomous of any intelligent agent, we would argue is impossible given evidence. And we approach it from a scientific standpoint. Yes.
So I just want to play that back and see if I'm summarizing that okay. So you're saying intelligent design will accept some degree of evolution, but it's more like some type of a transmutation. It's there. I think there are some barriers in intelligent design as to how much evolution they'll actually accept.
Right. Yeah. Certain barriers. It's like we're going to say finches will always stay finches, and humans will be humans. And so you're not going to see significant new functional systems being built. Right. We can build. We can repair certain proteins sometimes. In biology, we know it has certain reparative abilities, but it's limited, right? And what we're trying to do is test and find out what are the limits, and then from those limits, try to infer other more appropriate causalities. Ryan, you're up.
Just
Sorry.
one question.
Yeah.
Is there any consensus on that? Like when Adam and Eve they were created, how long ago?
Is there consensus on Adam and Eve? Well, hold on, I got to stand closer to him because he's got the microphone. Well, let me qualify that to say that would not be a position of intelligent design. Intelligent design is not a religious system. We're a scientific enterprise, and so you've now gone from the bounds of science into what I would call theology.
No, I meant actually human. Let's not say.
Oh, consensus of humanity, origins of humanity. You know what? That's a great question because, and unfortunately, I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but just to titillate you guys with it a little bit, one of the most profound discoveries that's happening in paleoanthropology is, and like all of the disciplines, is we're discovering that there is what's called a cultural Big Bang. Tattersall, I'm trying to think of the scientist, but anyway, he's doing this research where he's discovering. Ian Tattersall, yes, thank you. Tattersall is doing some great work on this, where he's discovering that, from this time horizon, that there's this like history in the geological record, and then there's just this sudden cultural explosion where now man comes on the scene, and now there's like religious expression, musical expression, artful expression, things that are just that are unknown in the rest of the animal kingdom. And so, again, from in that time horizon, the consensus is.
I've heard of people saying about 100,000 years.
Yeah, I've heard that 100,000 is about the upper limit.
Upper limit,
and then there's about 30,000 years ago.
I've
More
heard
of a
about
lower
10,000
limit.
to some.
Yeah. And actually, genetics is actually doing a lot of work to help us actually come to a more specific time horizon for that. And there's some fascinating stuff that's happening there as well, where we're discovering that man came about from almost a single point. Small population that could have been one man, one woman, and they located into southeastern Africa, and which is within the migratory path of, say, somebody from Adam and Eve, if you want to take it from a theological standpoint. But it defies a lot of the evolutionary explanation as well, because evolution would say that it would happen in mass around in slow progress. But most of the research is showing no, it was all of a sudden this sudden explosion and immersion of mankind that came about from a very small population, maybe one man, one woman.
Because if that would not have happened, we would not be today doing anything.
Yeah, right.
The animals would not have done anything. Because they were not thinking.
Yeah.
No science, no nothing.
Yeah, right.
No homes, no cars.
Anyway, I'm sorry. I'll let you go. Good questions there. Thank you guys.
All right, well, maybe just to maybe follow up or maybe reiterate some of the things that come up as far as what is it that we're really talking about when we talk about evolution. So there's almost 10 different definitions when you talk about evolution, so you really need to be careful about what are you really talking about. As was mentioned, evolution can mean change over time, and nobody takes issue with that. But the way that it's often used in school is this neo-Darwinian concept, and that is the idea that all of the diversity of life that we can see can be explained through random genetic mutations which bring about physiological changes in the organism that has a mutation, which get acted upon by natural selection, which is not random, and then that either fixes or selects out for that particular modified characteristic. Okay? So when we're talking about neo-Darwinism, that's really what we're talking about from a biological standpoint. There is this undergirding metaphysical view that is inherent in the neo-Darwinian perspective. And it's a view referred to as metaphysical naturalism or philosophical naturalism. And you can sort of summarize that in the sense that there's nothing other than matter and energy in the entire universe, and the universe is self-contained and self-sufficient unto itself and no need of explanation. Okay? So basically, there's nothing but matter and energy and the interchange between the two. That's basically it. So when we're talking about the issues that intelligent design has with the neo-Darwinian perspective, it is that can the creative power that is given to random genetic mutations and natural selection, so can the mutation selection mechanism bring about all of the diversity that we see in life, in the biosphere? And we would say that based upon the evidence, it seems like that's unlikely to be the case. So there's certainly going to be an allowance that we do see random genetic mutations, and we do see natural selection. These are real things. The mutation selection mechanism is real. You can measure how much mutation has actually occurred, but can it be given the credit that it often is to explain the vast diversity of life that we see? So that's really probably the key issue that the intelligent design takes issue with. All right, so this, just to give you sort of a heads up on what we're going to be talking, or at least what my part of the presentation is going to be covering. I'm going to cover some of the same stuff that Tyler's talked about, but I'm going to go through it really fast because I don't want to spend too much time on that since Tyler's already done a great job of going through some of the basics with intelligent design. And the latter part of the presentation is really going to get into some of the scientific research that's going on. But real quick, I'm going to at least give you a quick little bio about who am I, all right? So I am the Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness Center president. I have a bachelor's and master's in structural engineering that I got from UC San Diego a little bit of a while ago. And who is the Idea Center? Well, we are an organization that wants to promote intelligent design as a scientific theory and educate people about intelligent design as well as the scientific and philosophical challenges to naturalistic explanations for life, like I just discussed with you. And we also want to do what we can to help support academic freedom, because is there anybody who's seen the movie Expelled that came out in 2008? Okay, so there's a lot of intimidation that occurs, and some people have lost their jobs, essentially, because they've questioned aspects of evolution or even suggested intelligent design as a viable option to consider. And we also want to try to help students start idea clubs where they can have discussions on origins topics, hopefully in an environment that's not going to have them feel like somebody's jumping down their throat, which has become a lot more difficult, and that's why we have to let them know what some of their academic freedom rights are. All right, so what are idea clubs? Idea clubs are essentially extracurricular student-run clubs that do just like I said. They provide a forum for students and faculty and community members to explore, discuss, and debate the scientific evidence regarding the scientific theory of intelligent design and modern neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. All right. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about what is neo-Darwinism and intelligent design, the methodology of detecting design, the scientific nature of intelligent design. And And this last part is probably going to be the main part of interest that will address the question about what are some of the scientific biological research that's actually occurring. All right. So what is meant by evolution? I already spent time talking about this, so we'll go through this pretty quick here. All right. So there's a lot of definitions. Some people agree on them pretty well, and there's a lot of consistency, but others not so much. So what is it really? Well, you'll often find that people refer to evolution in one way, and then they will mean something else with it, or they will switch to another term or another example of it. They'll often use an example of what we would say is microevolution, and then say, this is how we can, because you see microevolution, say antibiotic resistance with bacteria, and therefore, because we can see that, therefore we know how humans came about from inanimate objects such as just chemicals and molecules somehow coming together. So normally I would ask what the definitions are that you can think of, but we're going to, again, try and go through this quick. So some of the most common that are taught in schools: change over time, common ancestry, or there's the one that I really focused on, is natural selection and random genetic mutation. So what are evolution's main claims? Again, I've already covered this, so we're going to go through it real quick. All organisms are related through common ancestors. All organisms and their genes arose through blind and unguided processes of random mutation, undirected natural selection, random genetic drift, and so on. So the basic idea is that all of the organism rose and persists because of the blind, unguided, and random processes of nature. Now, natural selection itself is not guided, but natural selection is essentially, it's going to be mathematical certainty that you're going to be selected for if you have this particular characteristic based upon the environmental conditions that are occurring at that time. Again, so I'm going to be repeating myself a little bit here from earlier. So how does evolution actually work? Well, you get these random genetic mutations which bring about these physical changes and variations in a given population that you have to be looking at. So the organisms are going to compete to survive and reproduce with limited resources. And because of that, those that are best adapted to survive in that particular environment are going to be able to reproduce and leave more offspring than others. All right, so this is survival of the fittest. This is the basic idea. So the survivors are often referred to as the fit, and the natural selection is a process that selects for particular characteristics, and over time, the fit species are the ones that actually evolve. All right, so now, what is intelligent design? All right, I'm going to take a quick survey here. Which of these two definitions I'm going to give you describes the scientific theory of intelligent design? So for item A, life is so complex that it couldn't have evolved, therefore it was created by a supernatural being. Or B, many features of nature are best explained by an intelligent cause because, in our experience, intelligence is the cause of their informational properties. How many think it's A? All right, how about B? All right, you're paying attention to Tyler. Good job. So that's essentially what Tyler described. So here's the core issue at the intelligent design debate. Are we the result of unguided chance processes or purposeful intelligent design? All right, now we're going to go through quickly the methodology of detecting design, which Tyler's covered, so I'm going to go through it again pretty quick. All right, so like Tyler mentioned, intelligent design reasoning is already used in science. Have any of you seen 2001: Space Odyssey? All right, I recognize this with the obelisk. 8 creatures that are going around it, because you wouldn't expect to see that kind of an object. And then you have some of the things that Tyler mentioned with the arrow, the stone arrow, or this figure that's been carved into the stone. So archaeology makes use of the same tools that intelligent design does. They look for these characteristics that are the hallmarks of designed objects. And then, of course, there's forensic science, which tries to determine whether or not a person who is dead was the cause of death a natural cause, or is there foul play? Were they murdered? Were they poisoned? Something along those lines. So these are all areas that are making use of intelligent design reasoning. And of course, intelligent design says, why don't we apply the same methodology to biological systems and define some of these same characteristics, that being the informational content and the specified complexity that Tyler briefly mentioned. The study program, that's also something that Tyler already mentioned, so I'm going to flip right through this one. All right, so how does intelligent design actually work? Well, it starts when an intelligent designer creates a pattern which has information and specification. So, like Tyler had mentioned, is intelligent design something that's based upon some type of religious claim to knowledge, or is it based upon something that we know from our common everyday experience? Well, our experience-based knowledge of information flow confirms that systems with large amounts of specified complexity, especially codes and languages, invariably originate from an intelligent source, from a mind or personal agent. All right, and this is from Steve Meyer's book. I'm sorry, not his book. Paper that he wrote in the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, which got Richard von Sternberg in trouble. If you remember the Expelled movie, this is a paper that got him in trouble. All right, so let's take a look at and start using some of the methodology we just discussed to try and see if we can infer design here. So when you see this mountain here, what is it? Well, it's pretty complex, right? Very complex, but very low probability. No specification to it, though. There's nothing recognizable to it. There's this random nature of the cracks, crevices, hills, and valleys, and so on that are associated with it. How about this one? It's immediately obvious, right? So you would not try to explain what you see here as a result of random weather patterns that carved this somehow through erosion processes in the mountain, right? Okay, so intelligent design infers that because there's a very low probability of getting this particular arrangement, in other words, there's this high complexity, and there's a specified pattern to recognize that these are past presidents of the United States, you can make this inference that something is designed. So to say it another way, we just looked at in Stephen Meyer quote, our experience-based knowledge of information flow confirms that systems with large amounts of specified complexity, especially codes and languages, invariably originate from an intelligent source, from a mind or personal agent. All right, now we're going to go through the scientific nature of intelligent design. And this is a key part that's going to help to set up the next part as far as the scientific nature of intelligent design. All right, so what is the scientific method? Well, the scientific method can be summarized in 4 steps, which I'm going to go through. But the scientific method is one way that we can go through a rigorous process to obtain knowledge about our world and universe through investigation and testing. And this is that 4-point summary that is probably well known to those of you who have a lot of science classes. So first, we make an observation of some particular event or an object. Based upon what we see, we come up with a hypothesis to try and explain what we've seen. Then we go through and we do some type of experiment or something to test our hypothesis. And based upon that experimentation, we then come up with a tentative conclusion. And that's the 4th part. Was our hypothesis correct? Does the testing confirm what our hypothesis was, or does it disconfirm? Does it show it was incorrect? Now let's contrast those with the religious method way of knowing. All right, so there's divine revelation, right, that we can get through special revelation, through reading, say, the Bible, or having general revelation, plus faith provides 100% belief. Okay, this is one way that somebody might describe the religious way of knowing something. Okay, you can contrast that with the scientific method, right? It's quite different in its approach. All right, so for the scientific method, let's talk about the observation. I'm going to go through this really quick here. All right, so we make an observation that the intelligent agent actions observe your natural world, and they can be described. All right, they produce high levels of complex specified information, abbreviated CSI. And CSI is the scenario that is very unlikely to happen, making it complex, and it conforms to an actual pattern that we recognize, which is making it specified. So designed objects, which are often reducibly complex as a particular type of specified complexity, they're an extreme form of CSI, which describe a minimum level of parts that are necessary for functionality. So, what would be the hypothesis then based upon this? Well, if a natural object X was designed, it should contain high levels of CSI, complex specified information. So we go through and we do an experiment to try and determine if it actually has that. So we test a biological structure for high CSI, or irreducible complexity, which is a very specific type of CSI. And we can do that through performing theoretical calculations, doing reverse engineering, doing knockout experiments, and the genetic of the organism we're looking at, doing computer simulations or mutational sensitivity tests, and so on. These are some of the things that we can do to try and test for this high levels of complex specified information. Based upon those tests, we can arrive at the conclusion that because there is high levels of complex specified information, a quality which is known to be produced only by intelligent agents, and because there is no other known mechanism to explain the origin of these irreducible complex biological structures, we conclude that they were intelligently designed. So we've just gone through very quickly how the scientific method is used in the intelligent design determination. So the complexity specification criterion is not the principle that comes to us demanding our unexamined acceptance. It is not an article of faith. And again, that was by William Dembski, and of course, again, similar quote to him: for design theorists, the conclusion of design constitutes an inference from data, not a deduction from religious authority. So, what does intelligent design mean? Intelligent design means that there's going to be some aspects of life that we can observe that were likely designed by an intelligent agency, all right? Not by some type of mechanistic cause. Now, can we identify the designer? We cannot. Because really all that intelligent design is, you can really summarize it in 2 words. Design, detection. That's all intelligent design is. So, with that very brief overview, so intelligent design theory follows the scientific method and thus cannot identify the designer. It makes no untestable unscientific statements about the supernatural, and because of that, intelligent design is based completely upon empirical evidence, and therefore it is a scientific theory rather than a religiously based theory. All right, now this is where the interesting part, I think this is what was really desired to be looked at tonight. All right, so I'm going to actually break this into several different components here. So the first part, we're going to talk about the scientific predictions of intelligent design, the novel approaches to scientific biological problems that have been motivated by an intelligent design view or perspective, and then the studies that have investigated neo-Darwinian mechanisms that are supposed to drive biological change. So we're going to start with the first part here, the scientific predictions of intelligent design. All right, so how many of you are familiar with the term junk DNA? Okay, so how many of you are familiar with that the idea junk DNA is now no longer considered an appropriate term, right? Okay, well, this was actually something that was predicted as far back as at least 1994 and possibly even prior to that. And Forrest Mims, he is an intelligent design proponent, and a letter that he sent to Science, which was rejected, and even the journal Science was recognizing, there's something else going on here, as you can tell from this description of the article, hints of a language in junk DNA. That's not really what we'd expect if junk DNA is left over. By the way, does anybody need a quick definition for junk DNA? Does everybody know what that is? Quick definition? Okay. So, back at the time when, well, I'll just quickly say it this way. Only about a little over 1% of our genetic code actually codes for proteins. So the central dogma for biology is that DNA provides the code for RNA, provides the amino acid sequences, which then get turned into proteins. So DNA, RNA, protein, essentially, that's a quick nutshell summary. Okay? So because only a little more than 1% actually codes for proteins, the rest of it was considered useless, not functional, non-functional junk. Okay? And that was because of some work or a paper that came out in 1972 by Dr. Susumu Ono, in which he used this term. He was the one who actually coined the term junk DNA. And it it was justified to be what would be expected from a neo-Darwinian perspective, because if there's been this great period of time of evolution that has occurred, then you would expect to find that there's a lot of leftover relics in our genetic code that are not really doing anything. We just have this leftover stuff that's been mutated and has lost its function, but we're still holding on to it. All right? So it's almost like along the lines of there's a mutational sink. That's not the term we use, but if you're going to have all of these genetic mutations, it's good that you have all of this useless junk DNA for these mutations to occur in, because you wouldn't want it to happen in a key area, right? So that was sort of the underlying idea. All right, so in this letter that Forrest Mims sent to Science based upon this, he noted that supposed junk DNA doesn't appear so useless to those of us who have designed and written code for digital controllers. Perhaps the junk DNA puzzle would be solved more rapidly if a few more computer scientists would make the switch to molecular biology. You can tell just by the names of the papers that were written here on the roles of repetitive DNA elements in the context of unified genomic epigenetic system. Okay, repetitive DNA elements are often considered to be useless junk. They don't code for any proteins. And then how repeated retroelements format genome function. Again, repeated elements not supposed to be coding for anything. Jonathan Wells in 2004, he notes that the fact that junk DNA is not junk has emerged not because of evolutionary theory, but in spite of it. On the other hand, people asking research questions in an ID framework would presumably have been looking for the functions of non-coding regions of DNA all along. And we might now know considerably more about them. All right, the group that I'm with, we have some articles since the early 2000s that have been referencing to junk DNA. Jonathan Wells had a book in 2011. Now, by the time the Jonathan Wells book had come out, it was pretty much recognized that junk DNA is really not that. So this is one example of there being vindication of intelligent design predictions based upon the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, that's that ENCODE project. And that was a study that had the majority of its data released this past September. There have been some papers that come out from that project in the 2000s. But here's one of the key points of that study, that these data enabled us to assign biochemical functions for 80% of the genome, okay? And it's likely that 80% will go to 100%. Now, to be fair, what exactly is a biochemical function? That's still being debated. Is it something that's actually a useful function? We're not so sure yet. So that's still trying to be determined. All right, so let's take a quick look. All right, so now we're going to start to get into some of the novel approaches to scientific biological problems. I'm going to try and hit some key points of that while we're going through some of these. All right, so this is intelligent design motivated research. Jonathan Wells wrote a paper back in 2005, and the title of it was "Do Centrioles Generate a Polar Ejection Force?" And what he did was he had, based upon his view of things being designed, he thought that maybe when it comes to the way that cells actually divide, centrioles are perhaps turbines, and it's maybe through the process of these turbines that are spinning that might be generating this force to pull the cell apart, that maybe in the process they don't get the proper regulation that occurs, and it maybe is malfunctioning that is causing cell division problems in the chromosomes and the DNA. But he treated it as being, he was motivated by his intelligent design perspective to look at the centrioles as machines, turbines, all right? So how was this actually, what did he actually do? It was primarily theoretical analysis that he did, and some calculations trying to determine what is the actual force that is being generated. So you can see from this picture that there's this centriole, and the picture with the red lines, that's essentially a blow up of that one section. And you see that there's this Archimedes screw that spins around, and in the process of spinning around, here's more of an isometric view. As it spins around, it forces fluid through essentially what are blades and then makes them start to turn around, all right? So this was motivated by an intelligent design perspective to look at it as a machine that maybe is malfunctioning. So his research, again, was theoretically based on analytical calculations from dynamics, basically, of what would be the force generated by this machine. And right now, at the time that this was published, it was just a theoretical approach. And so he's still doing current research on this. And what this does is that the implications of this research are that intelligent design can be a fruitful way to actually approach biological problems. And to sort of summarize what it was, so he was guided by his intelligent design thinking. What if centrioles really are tiny turbines? This is much easier to conceive if we adopt a holistic rather than reductionistic approach to this biological problem, and if we regard centrioles as design structures rather than accidental byproducts of neo-Darwinian evolution. Now, just to give a very brief summary again of what's actually cited as being the cause for this malfunctioning is he thought that it might be calcium deficiencies might cause an improper regulation, basically an on-off switch of the centriole of the turbine, causing damage to the chromosomes during cell division. So his thinking was that the centrioles start to spin, which then start to create this force that starts to pull the cell apart, but they basically stop spinning at a certain point because they've generated enough momentum to allow the cell to continue to separate by itself. But if it continues to spin, it may be generating too much force such that then the chromosomes are experiencing too much movement at that point in time, and they start to get damaged and torn apart in ways that are not normally expected. And this leads to literally damaged chromosomes, damaged DNA. Because this is something that is sometimes seen as far as damaged, in cancer cells, they often see damaged chromosomes and damaged DNA. Sometimes it's missing entirely, sometimes they got duplicates, and so on. All right, so, and this is again just a blow up of that lower area, and shows how the centrioles may spin around and create a wobble, which then is what generates this ejecting force. All right, and as far as the political and cultural backlash on this, people didn't really like what Jonathan Wells had to say. They tried to say, oh no, we came up with this before, and there were some papers that came out that were similar at about the same time. It was after Jonathan Wells did, but their approach was somewhat different than his. All right, so next item we're going to touch on computer simulations modeling biology. Again, this is an example of how intelligent design has provided the impetus to do some novel research, come up with some new ideas. Question?
So I just want to make sure I'm getting it to this point. You're basically saying that because the neo-Darwinists impose a reductionist view on science, it actually inhibits scientific progress. Whereas if you take a ID hypothesis, it can enhance and speed up the progress.
And that would definitely be the case when it comes to junk DNA, because I think that you can cite that as an excellent example because of the view that because these parts of the code, because these parts of the genetic code don't code the proteins, they probably don't do anything. And how many decades have been lost in the area of learning what junk DNA does? What kind of progress could be made had we had a different perspective? So yes, absolutely. All right, another question?
Like, I didn't understand the citation when they were comparing junk DNA to like computer programmers and coding. Like, what do we have like coding that's like junk DNA that doesn't necessarily do anything up front, but it does something for the code?
Yeah. Okay. So it's not so much that they did some computer simulations to arrive at an explanation for junk DNA. This computer simulation, this is something different from the junk
Right.
DNA now. So an example of, okay, so what it was considered to be functional DNA is something that provides a description to eventually arrive at a functional protein. If the DNA does not code for a protein, then it was considered to be junk. Now, what they found just to give an example of what they found a purpose and a use for junk DNA. So these repetitive elements, okay, where it's just the same sequence again and again and again and again and again. Okay, this is all. This is just obviously some weird mistake that just happened to occur through evolutionary processes. What does it actually do? Well, what they found is that when they start playing with that and start removing it or chopping it down, during embryological development or during embryogenesis, things start to get messed up during the process of different parts of during cell differentiation and specification. Okay, this is when the cells start to move to their final locations and start to take on the form of what they're going to finally be. When they removed some of this repetitive DNA, they started getting things happening at the wrong time during embryogenesis. So what they found was this repetitive DNA element was a timing mechanism. It was something for some of these other molecular machines to do while other processes were ongoing. Okay, so that's an example of what has been found for these junk DNA parts. Okay, so another novel idea that has occurred due to the intelligent design perspective is coming up with some computer simulations to try and model biology. And there's this new computer modeling software that came out a few years ago called Stylus, and it is a system for evolutionary experimentation based on a protein-proteome model with non-arbitrary functional constraints. That makes sense, right? Yeah, I'll admit that the technical terminology is sometimes hard to follow, so let me go into it in a little bit. Okay, here's just another journal article in which this was referenced, and I'll talk about a little bit later about what exactly this is. All right, so what you see here is you see a Chinese hand character on the left, and on the right is essentially what would be considered like a protein fold, okay? And what they did to try and determine if you want to try and model evolutionary processes, to try and determine if you can arrive at functional protein folds from a particular sequence or from a particular mutation, it's really difficult to try and model that. So they came up with a novel idea to try and model how much you could change something, how much you could mutate a protein fold essentially before it is either no longer recognizable or does it begin to take on some other functional shape. And so what they provided was a way to have an objective metric to determine how much you could change something from an original location before you arrive at something where it no longer works, you can no longer understand its meaning, or if it starts to take on a new meaning or a new function. All right? And so I'll just went ahead and quote, I'll just read right straight through this because Ann Gager does a great job of summarizing the main idea here. So what is Stylus? Why the Chinese character? Well, Ann Gager knows. What do hand Chinese characters and proteins have in common? Both can be thought of as two or three-dimensional functional shapes. Change their shapes significantly, and you change what they mean or do. Okay? This is the basic idea. So for proteins, the flow of functional information goes like this. You have your protein coding sequence, which gives rise to the three-dimensional structure once it folds into the proper shape. And it's that three-dimensional shape that provides a particular function. So again, continuing to quote Ann Gager here, if a code could be devised that specifies hand character traces in vector space, then the hand character set would have a similar information flow. That is, the hand coding sequence gives rise to a two-dimensional structure, which, based upon comparing it to a recognizable pattern, provides meaning. Now suddenly you have all of the parallels between genetic code and language become a rich environment in which to test evolutionary scenarios. All right, so it's because of this intelligent design thinking that they recognize that DNA provides has this high information content to specify proteins, all right? That was what led them to try and test this, was to try and find a coding, a language to try and model it from. And how the research was conducted is basically they generated this code that provides a way to generate these little, remember a vector has not only a length, but also a direction, all right? And that is how they're able to generate these novel shapes that are similar to, conceptually, the idea of a functional protein, which has a three-dimensional conformational shape to it. So the implications of the research, when considered between an evolution versus intelligent design debate, is that their models have been much more useful in this description that I've just shown, because some of the prior models had two major problems. I didn't actually want to talk about this one yet, but basically other computer models were attempting to model evolutionary ideas and sequences and occurrences were much more simplistic. They didn't really have this sort of three-step methodology that was used in the stylus program. All right, it was much more of an analog type of system. Something else that also that can be pointed out is what's noted in this study here, and that is that prior programs to try and model evolutionary theory often had intelligent design sneaking in through the back door, okay, to evolve these complex systems. And there have been several papers that have been able to identify this backdoor engineering, if you could say. In a sense, and these are programs of Vita Ev and Dawkins, he thinks it's like a weasel. These are examples of some of the computer programs that often have been put forward to suggest the ability for Darwinian mechanisms to create new information. All right. So what Dembski and Marx have done is they have provided the ability to determine how information has been snuck in through the back door. Essentially, this design has been brought in through the back door. I'm not going to go into that in much detail because it's relatively simple, but I'm going to kind of, definitely be fun here. In addition, it was an inadequate, this is what I mentioned previously, there's an inadequate representation of complex causal connections between the genotypes and the phenotypes. So the genotypes, that's when you get the genome sequence, okay, a particular sequence that's defined by the genome. And the phenotypes are what the actual physical characteristics that result from the expression of these genotypes. All right, so you can see here, these are some of the prior versions that were used to try and model evolutionary theory. And really, stylus is the one that's probably the closest to what you would see with life. It's still a model, so it's not perfect. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's much better than prior versions of modeling. All right. Oh, I have the slide in here. Okay, so essentially what they found was through the conservation of information that no search is better than any other search. And this is how they came up with a term called exogenic information to try and describe the information that can be present in the models. There's active information, which is something that's actually smuggled in, and there's endogenous information. That's when you take one and subtract it from the other to arrive at what is the actual information that's really present in the system without any assistance. So they provided a methodology to measure information that's smuggled into the program. And they discovered, like I just mentioned, that the programs noted do not model neo-Darwinian processes, instead they model intelligent design. And essentially, intelligent design is needed to evolve complex features. All right, so this next one has to do with computer simulations again. And this is what the academic editor acknowledged when they allowed those stylus papers to be in the journal. And by the way, he was not an intelligent design proponent. In fact, he even puts a caution about how one of these guys are intelligent design proponents, and so we were a little bit cautious, but they had a really novel and creative idea. And this is what he says. This is a highly original contribution in the category of simulation-based tools that can be used to investigate questions relating to genotype-phenotype interaction this drives the evolutionary process. It seems clear that the approach has merit as compared to other existing approaches. So he's acknowledging that prior approaches did not have the good matching or paralleling with real-life systems that this stylus program now provides. So as far as the impact that this has had in the debate, there's not been very much to really try and counter some of the information that's been provided by the stylus system. All right, so now we're going to look at what kinds of catalyzed reactions or provide ways for chemical reactions to occur since they increase these or break things apart. So it's through his studies that he was able to identify only in very rare instances do you actually get something that works. So amino acids must be just right to get functional protein folds. The proteins are multi-mutational features, okay? You're not going to be able to get at a functional protein but just by mutating this one little thing here and one little thing there. All right? You're not going to get onto these peaks, which is where you need to be in order to provide a specific function. There's many simultaneous mutations necessary to produce a functional protein fold. The odds of getting a functional protein fold, as was noted in the paper, or at least in one of the papers, was 1 over 10 to the 74th. And I think this is where some of the numbers that Tyler's coming from are derived from these numbers here. So that means that out of the hundreds of possibilities, right, this is my very simplistic example here. So what does this mean with that number? Okay, so you have those shapes that are supposed to represent amino acids in a particular chain. How many life forms have there been to try different amino acid sequences? Well, there's been about 10 to the 40th organisms during the history of the Earth. Now, how many will actually arrive at a functional protein? It turns out that only 1 in 10 to the 74th can actually get to a functional protein. So, 10 to the 40th chances divided by 10 to the 74th, what does it mean? Much less than 1, right? Okay, so you don't have enough probabilistic resources to get a functional protein by chance. All right, now there's others who have acknowledged this problem, all right? So this quote from Campbell's Biology, even a slight change in primary structure can affect a protein's conformation and ability to function. All right, the basic idea there is if you start to tweak a protein, you start to mutate it a little bit from its original form, it's not going to work properly anymore. Again, this is from another source who, as far as I'm aware, is not intelligent. Only a small fraction of the possible combinations of amino acids will fold spontaneously into a stable structure. If you make a protein with a random sequence of amino acids, chances are that it will only form a gooey tangle when placed in water. So what's the basic idea? Functional protein rarity implies fine-tuning of useful amino acid sequences and DNA coding. Now, this idea of fine-tuning is talked a lot about when it comes to the cosmological design, which we're not going to cover, but that can be for another talk, or for those of you who have seen The Privileged Planet, they talk about this fine-tuning of the physical constants that describe how the universe came to be. And Tyler touched a little bit on that. All right, so now we're still talking about the second question, as far as multi-mutations, rephrased. How quantitatively different are similar proteins? Okay, so what Doug Axe and then Ann Gager, who I've already mentioned previously, one of the things that they did was they actually attempted to convert these two particular proteins, these enzymes, KBL and BioF. What they did was they wanted to test gene duplication in a co-option model of protein evolution. And the reason that they wanted to try this was based upon Doug Axe's prior work, we knew that we could not arrive at new protein folds. So they wanted to go with something more modest, okay? But if you have similar protein folds but different chemistry, can you just modify the chemistry? You get some slightly different chemical constituents through the amino acids, and still maybe arrive at some new function. So this is basically a more modest version of what was just discussed, because it was recognized that to arrive at a protein fold, it's very unlikely to occur. All right, so you can see there's the KBL protein, there's bioF, and just sort of a quick glance, you can see they are rather similar, but if you start looking closely, you'll notice there are some slight differences in the shapes of things. All right, just to sort of point out, you notice this shape here is a little bit different than this one. All right, and over in this area, the wrapping out this way, we're reversing down. Okay, here you have the blue one is relatively straight here, or it's got a little twist here. Okay, so some minor differences there, but very similar. All right, so two very closely related enzymes. So, how many mutations are required to actually change KBL to bioF? This was essentially the question they asked. Well, what they found was there's at least 7 mutations that are required, and probably more. That's because they actually mutated 6 different things, and they were not able to get any actual function. So it's a multi-mutation feature. Why is this important? Why am I circling 7? Well, that's going to get into the next question, which is the third question, probabilistic resources. Based upon population genetics, this is where now we can start to try and make sense of that 7 mutations. What does that 7 mutations really mean? Well, population genetics is going to be something that provides us the ability to include mutation rates, population size, and generation periods to determine whether or not the necessary changes are feasible. Well, in 2004, Michael Behe and David Snow did some theoretical modeling which they tried to simulate evolution by gene duplication of protein features that require multiple amino acid residues. Okay, just basically looking at trying to get a bunch, they're trying to see what happens if you do get a gene to actually duplicate. Can you get it to have a new function at the active site here in the amino acid, when you actually mutate them? So can unguided evolutionary processes add novel proteins to functionally interface with existing original proteins? That's really what they did. They were trying to say, okay, if you have a new protein and it has this new shape, can it interface, can it actually work with the existing proteins that are already present? And the answer from their studies was that there are additional mechanisms to standard Darwinian processes are needed to generate many protein-protein interactions within a time frame and anticipated historical populations. All right, so this is a graph from that study, and what they looked at was if you were to have 10 to the 9th as far as a population size for multicellular organisms, and given the time to actually fix a given mutation is about this long, you're only able to get about two mutations actually in the time frame. All right, that's well below anything that's really going to be useful to you. Okay, so if there's more than 2 simultaneous mutations that are necessary to produce a functional protein interaction, it is unlikely to evolve in multicellular organisms on any reasonable time scale. All right, so they did some theoretical calculations to arrive at this answer. A similar study was done for unicellular or prokaryotes, okay, so bacterial populations. So I'm going to go through this really quick. This one, Doug Axe looked at, and what he found out when looking at bacterial populations is that a multi-mutation feature requiring more than 6 neutral mutations, neutral are the ones that don't have any effect, or 2 maladaptive, those ones that are harmful. But if you require more than those, you're not going to provide any advantage that could not arise in the history of life. All right? So they're calling that the KBL to bioF to get these 7 mutations. That means, based upon this study, that if more than 6 simultaneous mutations are necessary to produce a new protein function, it is unlikely to evolve in the bacterial populations on any reasonable time scale. All right? So, wow. I don't know how that happened. I need to go ahead and I'm going to stop there because there's a few other things, but I think you guys get the idea of some of the studies that have been done based upon an intelligent design approach to biological problems. They've actually provided some new ideas and provided some studies in the neo-Darwinian perspective that you would think would have been done in the past, but it turns out this is considered new research to really look at what are the feasible mutations that could occur to give rise to new proteins, to new folds, new kinds of systems. Are they really possible? And that's what a lot of the these researchers have looked at, and some of the novel approaches to solving biological problems with regards to Jonathan Wells' idea as far as let's look at these things as molecular machines, and then using new computer modeling techniques to get a much better parallel with actual systems. All right, I'll stop there. A lot of stuff.
Any questions on any of that so far, you guys?
That
was probably a bit technical, right? But we figured this is UCI, so you guys can handle it. But in summary, right, what we've seen is that what intelligent design is essentially doing, if you didn't catch a lot of the technical jargon, is that intelligent design is presuming that there are limits to the capabilities that biology can reproduce these functional systems, right? And so we'll trade out. But stay up here so that we'll answer some of the questions. But, and these things are only coming about because of the presumption, again, that there must be limits to evolution, because we see the signatures of intelligent agency, and so we presume that things are going to be complex and specified. And with those assumptions, we're doing many of these tests that are really creating significant difficulties for the evolutionary paradigm. So much so that, that there's been some pretty profound names out there who've come out actually against evolution in favor of intelligent design, names of people who are preeminently atheistic, who have no axe to grind against evolution, but have realized that because of, by nature, intelligent design research, have realized that evolution cannot be sustained. Some of these names, most recently, Thomas Nagel just produced a book, again, atheist philosopher, but has come out and said, hey, listen, people need to pay attention to what intelligent design is doing, because they basically told the evolutionary, or at least the neo-Darwinian form of evolution, that it can't work. Another famous guy, Anthony Flew, he would be the equivalent last century of Richard Dawkins. He is the most well-known, and his actual research paper against religion was the most read research paper in all of history. And he came out late in his life and basically said, because of intelligent design research and theories, so forth, he determined that there must be a God. Now, he's not a Christian by any means, but anyway, these are preeminent people that have built a career on refuting theistic implications, and yet have recognized that intelligent design has done a good job to show that if there's going to be a naturalistic explanation, it's got to be something other than neo-Darwinism. So, some other objections. You know, we have a list of some things that we were going to cover, of some of them, but we're kind of over time, right? What's the time that we need to break? We can stay here all night. But what are you guys hearing as far as refutations to intelligent design? Yes.
Well, I think the main one you hear repeatedly is that the intelligent design community is just a bunch of religious nuts trying to inject religion into science, right? And you're the Illustra media guy, is that right? Sorry, we're late. I was wondering, does Illustra have any plans to address that specific aspect? Because the way it seems to me is that the neo-Darwinists, by imposing a random genetic creativity theory, are injecting their orthodoxy into science more than religious people are out there trying to inject their religion into science. Do you have any plans in Illustra to address that problem, or is it going to be along the same lines of what you created before?
Yeah, the answer is no, but probably because I don't think a lot of people buy it on DVD. But because I think they answer, it's hard to develop an hour-long documentary on that answer. But I think there's a lot of validity in what you're saying, in the sense of, I don't know if I would say that they're injecting more of it, but I think it's at least fair to say that there are some religious implications to even evolution. And if we take even the U.S. Supreme Court's definition of what religion is, and it's that which, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but they define it as any explanation for the way things are, why things are, that would normally be filled by the role of God. And so what we see what evolution is trying to do, as Dawkins has admitted, is he says evolution has made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, and that they're explaining away all of the roles that God would normally play. And you know, there have been throughout history even evolutionists who unabashedly wanted to start the Church of Evolution. You know, ironically, you don't find in any other discipline ideas of where people take on the name of the concept, right? There's Darwinists, right? But we don't know like Newtonianists or Einsteinianists, right? But it's like there's this.
Or about Darwin Day,
Right. Right.
Religious perspective, so to speak.
Yeah, and so I think, you know, like Karl Popper is a philosopher of science, and I think he articulated this very well. He goes, you know, one of the measures of something that is scientific is how much they are willing to subject it to criticism. And like when Einstein came out with the theory of relativity, he basically sent it to everybody he knew and said, please tell me where I'm wrong, because I'm really interested in finding out what's true. And if it's wrong, I want to know. And so before it really got out there, he kept saying, and he kept challenging it. He wanted everybody to engage with it as much as possible to find out or point out what's potentially wrong. We've seen an entirely different attitude today about evolution, in that it's basically the entrenched institution that you are not allowed to touch or question. And as the Expelled movie pointed out, there's a lot of backlash to it. But anyway, but no film project.
Great DVDs, by the way.
Thank you. Unless, of course, somebody wants to fund that project, we'd be happy to do that. You got a checkbook, you know. Other questions. I mean, religion. Ryan covered that a little bit, that this is not a religious pursuit. We don't name the designer. And so intelligent design tries to go no further than what the science would say. Right? Now, certainly it has some corollary or confluence with religious thought, but sometimes, yeah, in fact.
The big problem that they seem to point out every time this is brought up is, well, there are no ID scientists in peer-reviewed journals, so they're not published. They're not up to the rigors of the scientific community. Therefore, there is no legitimacy in that movement.
Yeah. What do you want to address first?
Protein science, genomic research, quarterly review of biology. Those are just a few that are actually peer-reviewed journals in which intelligent design opponents have done research. There's now a pro-intelligent design journal out there called Biocomplexity. Now some might say, okay, well that's pro-ID, so it doesn't count. So basically I think that they are not in touch with the times, because back in 2011 there was the 50th peer-reviewed piece of literature that came out. That includes books as well. So things have gone through Oxford University Press and things along those lines. So I can send you a link that lists all of these so they can be pointed to.
Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon that we deal with, where like literally it's that this objection will come up regularly, and it's like we just celebrated a couple of years ago that we had our 50th peer-reviewed article published, and we're you bring it up, and then suddenly it's like people have a lot of trouble with it and play around with it. But I would say another thing too, that by the way, the peer-reviewed article process is not a very reliable source anyway. There are a lot of ways, people pointed out the fact that there's a lot of ways to, I guess, create subterfuge in the scientific process. One of the things I'll give you an example of is that the gentleman who first proposed continental shifting, he was rejected from every peer-reviewed article. They just considered it just unworthy of science. And it took them a long time to get through, and suddenly, finally, and now it's the general consensus that everybody believes in continental shifting, right? But anyway, so the peer-reviewed system failed him in there, and there's countless examples of that. Anyway, but yeah, so
it's kind of a follow-up. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So when let's say this list that you have here, does that include, say, the stuff from
that I went over?
like Henry Morris, those guys, the Young Earth guys, or
No, because
all that stuff. This is purely intelligent design, like of the biologic style of the.
Intelligent design would have no young Earth
Right.
affinity, because again, it's a scientific approach.
And
Young Earth, you can very. I'm sorry. I was
that's
gonna-
okay.
But
When you're done.
the young Earth is substantiated almost entirely from a biblical perspective, and quite frankly, from I think it's an improper hermeneutic from the Bible anyway. So people that are doing that are actually not reading the Bible well enough. But yeah, it wouldn't be an intelligent design endeavor.
So intelligent design does not take a stance on the age of the Earth. There are people who are both in the old Earth perspective. Sorry. There are people who come from the old Earth perspective as well as the young Earth perspective that are involved with the intelligent design movement. Because remember that all intelligent design can say is something is designed. It doesn't say when it was designed. So admittedly, there are a lot of people who have a personal view on the age that are involved in. Probably the majority in the intelligent design movement are old, but there are some young.
But none of the research, peer-reviewed articles would be from a young Earth perspective.
Yeah, generally intelligent design adopts the mainstream view for the age uncritically. There's really, it doesn't really take a stance on one or the other. It just says, okay, if this is true, then what we have. And in fact, you can see, based upon some of the information you just covered, that let's say that you grant this long periods of time, it's not going to be enough time. It's just not. It's very, very unlikely. Can we say it's impossible? No. Okay, but it's extremely unlikely based upon probabilistic resources available.
Any questions?
all right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, you keep going.
That's
As long as
okay.
you're throwing your hand up.
Yeah.
Unless somebody else has a question. Okay, does that include also the biologos perspective, the theistic evolution, within this list of?
No, Biologos is actually, there, for those of you who are not familiar, Biologos is a theistic evolution group, and they generally are not very fond of intelligent design. That would basically be the quick way to put it.
Yeah.
So, do you want to add anything?
No, that's perfect. Yes.
Why is number 50 significant?
Why is the number 50 significant? It's just to say that there are now over that many.
It's
So
divided,
for
it's divided by 10.
Comparative to other, like what's the average article in peer review in scientific arena?
I mean, it would depend upon the discipline, and I mean, that's just hard to say. I mean, 50 is, we'd like it to be a lot more, for sure. But does it answer the question? I mean, are there no people say no peer-reviewed articles, and yet there's, over 50. And actually, I think since then we've had a couple, right?
Yeah.
So,
That was back in 2011.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, we'd like it to be a lot more. But there's not a lot of people that are favorable to intelligent design, and they'll reject it outright just because it's that. I mean, he didn't cover a lot of research projects that are out there, by the way. I mean, there's Dr. Seelke is doing did research based upon determining the limits that bacteria can evolve in order to, and his hope was to determine an upper limit so that he could help motivate better antibiotic medicine, so that as we keep feeding our biology with antibiotics that will deter it, but actually they grow resistance to that, right? We've gotten this now spiraling problem where now most of the bacteria out there can resist our antibiotics, and it's becoming a serious problem. Well, he determined from an intelligent design perspective that there must be a limit to its ability to do that. And he did this research. He was rejected from it a week before he was supposed to move out to Stanford. And he sold his house, moved everything, was going to go there to do the research, and they shut down the program because they found out that he was doing this from an intelligent design perspective. Right? He then fortunately found another professor, because he'd already got an apartment and everything, who picked it up and said, yeah, you can use my laboratory. He did this research, and he published and showed that if you make 2 environmental stressors rather than 1, it's impossible for it to resist that. And he could eradicate these types of bacterial problems if there could be widespread adoption of his research. But he doesn't get a lot of notoriety for it because it's an intelligent design motivating work. But we would eliminate that problem, right? The problem that we hear over and over that we can't stop the bacterial resistance in our biology was becoming a serious problem. We could eradicate that if people would pay attention to intelligent design.
So, this is what Tyler just mentioned.
Oh yeah, there you go. I had it queued up.
Yeah, so, and we have several cases in which intelligent design proponents attempted to get an article published, but they were very close, and then all of a sudden there was no longer any communication, or said, oh, we just learned that you're intelligent design proponent, you're not going to publish your research. There are documented cases of that. How evolution works. Duh. So, and I don't like it for that reason, because it's not in the unifying theory of the current paradigm.
You know what? Since there's no hands up, anything if there's a question, raise your hand. But I'll just say something. You know, one of the objections is that ID doesn't make any predictions. Well, Ryan talked through that, but I mean there are many other predictions that intelligent design makes, and I'll just list a few of them, and then you can begin to look at what does it look like in the world is becoming. Well, some of these predictions are, for example, that we would find increasingly more and more attributes of the way that the universe is put together that would make it improbable for life to exist. Okay, that's one. And there's a group that has been pulling out research over many years, and they started with about 20 different attributes of the universe that needed to be finely tuned. They're at something like 220 now, where it's just the number continues to grow. Right? That's an intelligent design prediction that's coming true. Second, another prediction, that the complexity of biological life is such that it becomes increasingly improbable for it to be able to come about by just mere chance, right? I already talked to that. Again, that's coming out to be true. Prediction, I do a whole talk on the fossil record and say, if we're going to look at the actual evidence in geology, what predictions would we make from the two different paradigms? And the different predictions, like, for example, intelligent design would say, well, we would see a sudden emergence of life forms. We would see stasis, which means they don't change much over time. They have pretty much predominantly the same body plan. There would be extinction would happen from either cataclysmic events or ecological events, but not because of being replaced by another biological form. Another prediction. I'm trying to think of.
As far as if common ancestry were true, then you would expect to see this nice branching pattern. We don't see the similarity. Instead, you see what's referred to as a bush. Depending upon what kind of protein you're looking at, you'll arrive at a different phylogeny or family tree or relationship than you would when you compare another molecular, look at another molecular study. The molecular studies do not match the morphological studies. That's based upon the gross body plan. So from an intelligent design perspective, you would expect an intelligent agent or intelligent designer to reuse the same descriptions for molecular machines in different organisms, right? That would not be necessarily related from a common ancestry perspective. So that's another prediction.
Yeah,
you would expect to find this.
Yeah, lack of transitional forms, and there's just a long list. And what we're finding out is that everything that we're studying in the geological record is, in fact, substantiating the intelligent design prediction and actually refuting what Darwinists would actually have predicted. So a lot of predictive power available in intelligent design. Is it science? We've hopefully covered that, but I will say that even Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, said that the question to supernatural intelligent agency in causality and so forth is unquestionably a scientific question. So even him, who's not a fan of intelligent design, would at least acknowledge that this question is a scientific one. Any other questions? Okay, with that left, what about leaving the scientific aspect of it and taking off the intelligent design hat? Okay, because some people have some biblical questions. But what does this mean for the theist? Certainly there's a corollary, right? And this is not, again, I don't do this but because it's a ratio Christi meaning. you know, one of the things that people have asked too in these meetings, and Jim asked us to kind of cover this. Well, how do we take that if we are Christian? Well, again, this is not an intelligent design thing, but just more from a pastoral thing. But hopefully, what we've demonstrated today is that when we see or look at this intelligent designer, we see some pretty profound characteristics of a super intelligence that so far exceeds our capabilities, as well as a deliberate plan to bring about things for essentially higher consciousness like mankind. Right? However that happens, and we can still investigate many ways that happens, but nonetheless, if we know this intelligent designer had evidently higher life forms in mind for us, right? And what's interesting too, by the way, is a matter of segue. If you're studying anything in quantum